In the heart of Texas ranch country, an aging rancher tends to his modest farm, his hands trembling slightly as he mends the morning's broken fence line. The local bandits mock his careful movements daily, unaware that those shaking hands once belonged to the most legendary Marine Scout sniper in all of Afghanistan. They're about to learn that while warriors may age, their aim never does. The sun-bleached roads of Miller's Creek wound through the rolling hills of Silverleaf County like dusty ribbons, connecting a scatter of family ranches that had weathered generations of Texas storms. These days, the small town's peace was as fragile as morning frost, with whispers of trouble drifting in from neighboring counties like tumbleweeds before a storm. Yet most folks went about their business as usual, clinging to their routines like anchors in uncertain times. At the heart of this unfolding story sat Whispering Pines Ranch, a modest spread that stretched across 200 acres of Texas hill country. The ranch's owner, Tom Reeves, had purchased the property 5 years ago after returning from his final deployment, seeking the kind of peace that only wide-open spaces could provide. To passing travelers, the ranch appeared unremarkable, a weathered farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a red barn in need of fresh paint, and a small herd of cattle grazing in the distance. Tom himself seemed to embody the quiet dignity of his ranch. His tall frame, still straight despite his 65 years, moved with the measured grace of a man who'd learned to conserve his energy in harsh environments. His silver hair and lined face spoke of years spent under unforgiving suns, while his faded work shirts and worn boots blended seamlessly with the other ranchers who gathered at Mary Ellen's diner in town. The morning light painted long shadows across the ranch's front yard as Tom worked methodically to repair a section of fence, his hands showing a slight tremor as he handled the wire cutters. Young Daniel Martinez, watching from his perch on a nearby fence post, noticed how his mentor's movements, though careful, never wasted an inch of motion. The boy had become a frequent visitor to Whispering Pines, drawn by Tom's quiet strength and seemingly endless knowledge of ranch life. "Mr. Reeves," Daniel called out, swinging his legs against the weathered wood. "How come you always check the fence line first thing, even before feeding the cattle?" The question hung in the morning air as Tom straightened up, his eyes scanning the horizon with an instinct honed by years of training he never spoke about. "Son," he replied, his voice carrying the soft rasp of Afghan sandstorms long past. "In this life, it's not just about knowing your boundaries. It's about maintaining them." The words carried a weight that Daniel couldn't quite grasp, but would soon understand all too well. Before we delve deeper into this tale of hidden strength and coming storm, tell us where you're watching from. If this story of a warrior who never lost his edge speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed. Tomorrow's video will reveal another remarkable chapter of American courage that you won't want to miss. The town of Miller's Creek had recently been plagued by a series of increasingly bold cattle thefts, each one pushing closer to the heart of the community. Sheriff Kate Rodriguez, despite her best efforts, found herself playing catch-up with rustlers who seemed to know the lay of the land better than they should. What troubled her most weren't the thefts themselves, but the methodical nature of them. These weren't ordinary cowboys gone bad, but professionals with military-grade equipment and tactical training. Tom Reeves watched these developments with the kind of patience that had once kept him motionless in desert hide sites for days at a time. Each morning as he made his rounds, his keen eyes noted fresh tire tracks on rarely used backroads, unfamiliar dust patterns that spoke of nighttime activities, and the subtle signs of surveillance that most civilians would miss. He said nothing of these observations to anyone except Sheriff Rodriguez, who recognized in his detailed reports the same precision she'd encountered during her own military service. The locals who knew Tom only as the quiet rancher with trembling hands had no way of knowing that those same hands had once thread shots through desert winds at distances that seemed impossible. They couldn't see that behind his gentle demeanor lay the kind of strength that had earned him the nickname Ghost among both allies and enemies in the mountains of Afghanistan. To them, he was just another aging veteran trying to carve out a peaceful existence in the Texas hill country. But peace, as Tom well knew, was often just the quiet before the storm. And a storm was coming to Miller's Creek, bringing with it men who would learn too late that some legends don't fade. They just acquire better cover. The scorching Texas sun hung like a molten coin over Whispering Pines Ranch, a modest spread nestled between the rolling hills and ancient oak groves of Silverleaf County. Every morning, without fail, Thomas "Tom" Reeves would emerge from his weathered farmhouse at precisely 6 a.m., his silver hair catching the first rays of dawn as he made his rounds. The local feed store owner liked to joke that you could set your watch by old Tom's routine, checking the fence lines, tending to his small herd of cattle, and finally settling into his favorite spot on the wraparound porch with a steaming cup of black coffee. To most folks in the nearby town of Miller's Creek, Tom was just another aging rancher trying to keep his small piece of Texas alive. They knew him as the quiet man who'd stop by Mary Ellen's diner every Wednesday for the chicken fried steak special, always leaving a generous tip despite his modest means. He'd chat with the regulars about rainfall and cattle prices, never raising his voice above a gentle rumble that matched his careful movements. Sarah Chen, who ran the general store with her husband Mike, kept a special order of peppermint candies just for Tom. He'd buy a small bag every week, sharing them with the local children who'd gather around him at the town's weekly farmers market. While their parents haggled over fresh vegetables and homemade preserves, Tom would tell the youngsters stories about the desert plants that could save your life, or how to read approaching storms in the way the birds flew. Among his most devoted listeners was 10-year-old Daniel Martinez, a bright-eyed boy whose family had recently moved to Miller's Creek from Austin. Daniel was fascinated by Tom's seemingly endless knowledge of the land and its ways. He'd often ride his bike out to Whispering Pines after school, helping Tom with simple chores while pestering him with endless questions about ranching life. What Daniel and the other townsfolk didn't see were the small details that might have told a different story. They didn't notice how Tom's eyes, still sharp as cut glass despite his years, constantly scanned his surroundings with military precision. They missed the way he always chose seats with clear views of all entrances and exits, or how his work-worn hands, despite their apparent stiffness, could still disassemble and reassemble his old hunting rifle in under a minute, blindfolded. The locals didn't know about the locked trunk in Tom's study, hidden beneath a faded quilt his late wife had made. Inside lay carefully preserved memories of another life, a Marine Corps Scout sniper badge worn but polished, photographs of younger men in desert camouflage, and medals that spoke of valor in conflicts most civilians only read about in history books. Among these treasures was a worn logbook, its pages filled with coordinates and confirmed distances that would have made even seasoned military marksmen whistle in appreciation. Mary Ellen, who'd owned the diner for 20 years, sometimes caught glimpses of something else behind Tom's gentle demeanor. She'd seen how he'd tensed almost imperceptibly when the 4th of July fireworks started early last summer, the way his hands had steadied rather than shaken in that moment of surprise. She'd watched him help old Bill Thompson change a flat tire, noting how he'd positioned himself with perfect sightlines to both ends of the street, an unconscious habit that spoke of years of training. The Wednesday afternoon routine at Mary Ellen's had become something of a ritual in Miller's Creek. Tom would arrive at 1:30 p.m. sharp, settling into his usual corner booth where he could see both the entrance and the street beyond. He'd order the same meal, chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, and green beans, though lately he'd started letting young Daniel join him, teaching the boy proper table manners and sharing stories about the right way to handle cattle during storms. These quiet afternoons were part of the rhythm of Miller's Creek, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, but also knew when to mind their own. The regulars had learned to respect Tom's space, understanding that some men carry their stories close to their hearts, sharing them only when they're ready. They accepted his occasional 1,000-yard stare, the way he'd sometimes pause mid-sentence as if listening for something only he could hear. Sheriff Kate Rodriguez, a former Army MP herself, was one of the few who suspected there might be more to Tom Reeves than met the eye. She'd noticed how he maintained his fence lines with almost tactical precision, how his daily routines varied just enough to avoid predictability, a habit that spoke of serious military training. But like everyone else in Miller's Creek, she respected his privacy, understanding all too well that some veterans prefer to leave their service years in the past. The peace of Tom's carefully ordered world would soon be shattered, though none of them knew it yet. The signs were there for those who knew how to read them. Increased cattle rustling in neighboring counties, strange vehicles passing through town, and rumors of a new gang making their way across Texas, targeting isolated ranches with a precision that suggested inside information. But for now, in the warm afternoon sun of another Texas Wednesday, Tom Reeves simply sat in his corner booth at Mary Ellen's, teaching young Daniel Martinez the proper way to cut his meat, his weathered hands steady as they gripped the diner's worn silverware. The depth of Tom Reeves's character lay buried beneath years of careful misdirection, like ammunition cached in desert sand. Those who spent enough time around him might catch glimpses of his true nature, though few in Miller's Creek knew how to read the signs. The way he could name every bird by its call wasn't just the knowledge of a rancher. It was the expertise of a man who'd once used those same birds as early warning systems in hostile territory. His seemingly casual habit of counting the number of people in any room he entered wasn't age-related anxiety, but rather the ingrained instinct of someone who'd survived countless combat situations. Sarah Chen from the general store had begun to notice these little details over the years. She saw how Tom would position himself near support columns during the town's monthly meetings, his back never fully turned to any entrance. During last summer's county fair, she watched him instinctively create overlapping fields of fire with his eyes whenever he moved through the crowd, though he probably didn't even realize he was doing it. The local children adored Tom's stories about desert survival, not realizing these weren't tales learned from ranching books, but hard-earned wisdom from deployments in some of the world's most unforgiving terrains. He taught them how to find water by reading the landscape, which plants could save your life, and how to navigate by stars, all skills that had once meant the difference between life and death in places he never named. Daniel Martinez had become particularly attuned to these hidden depths in his mentor. The boy noticed how Tom's hands, which trembled when handling coffee cups or fence wire, became preternaturally steady whenever he demonstrated how to hold a hunting rifle. During their Wednesday afternoon sessions at Mary Ellen's diner, Daniel observed how Tom always served himself last, a habit bred from years of ensuring his men ate first. Hidden away in Tom's study, beneath stacks of cattle breeding records and veterinary receipts, lay evidence of another life entirely. A worn leather journal contained hand-drawn maps of mountain passes in Afghanistan, with notations in a shorthand that only other scout snipers would recognize. The margins were filled with ballistic calculations and wind corrections that had once guided bullets to targets over a mile away. In a locked drawer wrapped in oiled cloth rested a coordinator of fire badge that spoke of his role in training a new generation of Marine snipers. Alongside it lay photographs. Tom, decades younger, prone behind a rifle in desert camouflage. Tom with his sniper team, their faces weathered by sun and purpose. Tom receiving commendations that were never officially recorded, for missions that officially never happened. Sheriff Rodriguez had begun piecing together parts of Tom's background through her military connections. His record, what little wasn't classified, read like a legend. Highest confirmed kill count in his unit's history. Multiple distinguished service medals and a reputation for impossible shots that had earned him that ghost call sign. More telling were the gaps in his service record, the blank spaces that spoke of classified operations and deniable missions. The sheriff kept this information to herself, understanding that Tom had chosen Miller's Creek precisely because it offered him the anonymity he desired. She recognized in him the same careful awareness that she developed during her own military police service, the constant reading of sightlines, the automatic identification of choke points and potential cover, the practiced art of appearing completely unremarkable. Mary Ellen, who prided herself on reading people as well as she read recipes, had her own theories about Tom. She noticed how he would sometimes pause in the middle of a conversation, his head tilting slightly as he processed sounds that others missed. During the rare occasions when motorcycles backfired outside her diner, she saw how his hands would instinctively move to positions that suggested muscle memory of weapons long set aside. The diner owner had also observed Tom's interaction with his few personal possessions. The old Stetson he wore wasn't just a hat. It was positioned precisely the same way every time, brim adjusted to shield his eyes while maintaining maximum peripheral vision. The seemingly simple walking stick he'd started carrying last winter was weighted in a way that suggested it could become a weapon in practiced hands. Even Tom's ranch itself told a story to those who knew how to read it. The fence lines weren't just well maintained. They were positioned to create interlocking fields of observation. The seemingly random placement of his storage sheds actually provided perfect cover and concealment for anyone needing to move unseen across the property. The old windmill that most folks thought was just for show provided an ideal sniper's nest, with commanding views of all approaches to the ranch. These subtle signs of Tom's past were woven into the fabric of his daily life, visible yet unseen, like the irrigation lines that ran beneath his pastures. They surfaced in the way he taught Daniel to track animals, showing the boy how to read the landscape as both predator and prey. They emerged in his careful maintenance of his hunting rifles, each one cleaned and sighted with the precision of a man who understood that accuracy wasn't just about hitting targets. It was about responsibility and respect for the craft. The truth about Tom Reeves lay in these details, in the space between who he appeared to be and who he had been. It lived in the muscle memory that turned everyday movements into tactical advantages, in the vigilance that masqueraded as simple rancher's caution, and in the skills that he passed off as ordinary country knowledge. Like the predators he'd once tracked through mountain passes half a world away, Tom had learned the art of hiding in plain sight, becoming so much a part of the landscape that most never noticed the warrior in their midst. The peace of Miller's Creek shattered, like a clay target, the day Marcus Mad Dog Mitchell and his crew rode into town in their mud-splattered pickup trucks. They weren't the usual sort of trouble that occasionally drifted through, not common cattle rustlers or petty thieves. These men carried themselves with military precision poorly disguised beneath civilian swagger, their movements betraying the kind of tactical training that set Tom's internal alarms ringing. Mitchell himself cut an imposing figure as he stepped out of his black Ford F-350, his combat boots raising dust on Main Street. Standing 6'3" with shoulders like barn doors, he wore his dishonorably discharged status like a badge of honor. His face, marked by a jagged scar running from left temple to jaw, told stories of violence that his cold blue eyes seemed eager to repeat. A former Force Recon Marine turned mercenary, Mitchell had spent the years since his discharge building a crew of ex-military outcasts who'd found civilian life too tame and legal work too restrictive. His right-hand man, Carlos Swift Mendez, was a former Army Ranger whose quick hands and quicker temper had earned him both his nickname and a dishonorable discharge. Mendez moved with the contained energy of a rattlesnake, his lean frame belying the strength that had allowed him to survive 3 tours in Iraq before a bar fight with a superior officer had ended his military career. The youngest of their core group, Jamie Tech Wilson, had washed out of Navy SEAL training but kept the tactical knowledge and chip on his shoulder. Barely 30, with wire-rimmed glasses and a laptop always within reach, he brought modern technology to their operations, using surveillance drones and thermal imaging to plan their raids with military precision. They rolled into Miller's Creek like a storm front, taking over the back room of the Rusty Spur Saloon and turning it into their command center. Within days, they'd established a presence that set the whole town on edge. Their crews drove through the streets at all hours, conducting what they called security surveys of local ranches, surveillance wrapped in the thin veneer of a legitimate security consulting business. Tom Reeves first encountered them on a quiet Tuesday morning at Mary Ellen's diner. He was enjoying his usual coffee when Mitchell's crew shouldered their way in, claiming the largest booth with the casual arrogance of men unused to being refused. The diner fell silent as Mitchell's gaze swept the room, settling on Tom with the predatory focus of a man sizing up potential threats. "Well, what do we have here?" Mitchell's voice carried the forced joviality of a man who'd learned to mimic normal social interaction without quite getting it right. "Looks like we found ourselves the local welcoming committee." He approached Tom's table, intentionally looming over the seated rancher. "Name's Mitchell. My associates and I are setting up a security consulting operation in the area, helping folks protect what's theirs." Tom's hands remained steady on his coffee cup, his eyes never leaving Mitchell's face. "Seems to me folks around here have been managing just fine," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded sniper teams through impossible missions. Mitchell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Times are changing, old-timer. World's getting more dangerous every day. Smart folks are starting to see the value in professional protection." He leaned closer, dropping his voice. Shame if anything were to happen to all these nice ranches around here. Cattle rustling's become quite sophisticated these days. Takes military-grade equipment just to keep up. From his corner booth, Carlos Mendez watched the exchange with predatory interest, his hand resting casually near the concealed holster under his jacket. Jamie Wilson sat at the counter, apparently absorbed in his laptop but recording every detail of the interaction. Sheriff Rodriguez entered the diner just then, her badge catching the morning light. Mitchell straightened up, his demeanor shifting smoothly into professional courtesy. "Sheriff," he nodded. "Just introducing ourselves to the local citizens. Community outreach, you understand?" Kate Rodriguez's expression remained neutral, but her hand rested purposefully on her service weapon. "Mr. Mitchell, I trust you and your men have all the proper permits and licenses for operating a security business in Silverleaf County." "All filed and pending, Sheriff," Mitchell replied with a cold smile. "We're just getting to know the lay of the land, making sure folks understand the services we're offering." His gaze flickered back to Tom. "Some people might need more convincing than others about the dangers out there." As Mitchell's crew filed out of the diner, Mary Ellen hurried over to Tom's table. "You okay, Tom?" "Those men." She trailed off, watching through the window as the black trucks pulled away. "I'm fine, Mary Ellen," Tom assured her, his voice carrying the same calm it had maintained through firefights and ambushes. "Some men think they can own the world through fear. They usually learn different sooner or later." But Tom had recognized something in Mitchell's crew that worried him more than their intimidation tactics. He'd seen the way they moved, the hand signals they used, the practiced coordination of men who'd operated in combat zones. These weren't just thugs playing at being soldiers. They were trained operators who'd chosen to use their skills for profit rather than duty. Later that afternoon, as Tom drove his old pickup back to Whispering Pines, he noticed a drone following his truck, its small form barely visible against the Texas sky. On his radio scanner, hidden beneath the seat, he picked up encrypted communications that spoke of professional surveillance operations. Mitchell's crew wasn't just casing the area. They were running a full tactical assessment of every ranch in the county. The war had followed him home, wearing different uniforms, but fighting with the same tactics he'd once employed himself. As Tom parked his truck in front of his house, his mind was already running through scenarios and countermeasures, lessons learned in combat zones that he'd hoped never to need again in peaceful Texas hill country. The first real confrontation came on a sweltering Friday morning, as Tom was repairing a water pump at his southern fence line. The rumble of heavy engines announced the arrival of Mitchell's crew before their black trucks appeared on the dirt road bordering Tom's property. Through decades of trained instinct, Tom noted their tactical approach: 3 vehicles, staggered formation, optimal spacing for rapid deployment. Mitchell stepped out of the lead truck, his boots crushing the dried grass beneath them. Mendez and Wilson flanked him, while 2 other men Tom didn't recognize remained in the vehicles, their positions giving them clear fields of fire. The formation was too precise to be casual. This was a practiced intimidation tactic Tom had seen used in villages half a world away. "Morning, neighbor," Mitchell called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a shark's smile. "Thought we'd stop by, see how you're getting along. Been hearing some concerns about security in these parts." He gestured at the fence line. "Lot of property to protect out here for one man, especially at your age." Tom straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, the same pace he'd used when adjusting his rifle scope for crucial shots. "Appreciate the concern," he replied, his voice level, "but I've got all the security I need." Mendez circled slightly to the left, a flanking maneuver disguised as casual movement. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his tone suggesting anything but respect. "Times are changing. Just last week, the Peterson Ranch lost 30 head of cattle. Professional job, high-tech equipment, the kind of thing that makes insurance companies very nervous." "Funny thing about that Peterson raid," Tom responded, his eyes tracking every minute movement of Mitchell's men. "Way I heard it, those cattle thieves knew exactly when and where to hit, almost like they had inside information." Mitchell's smile tightened. "World's full of coincidences, old-timer. Smart folks learn to protect themselves. For a reasonable monthly fee, We can make sure nothing unfortunate happens to your livestock." Young Daniel Martinez, who'd been helping Tom with the water pump, stepped closer to his mentor. The boy's presence added an unexpected variable to the confrontation, and Tom could see Mitchell's crew recalculating their approach. "Daniel," Tom said quietly, "head on up to the house now." The boy hesitated, but something in Tom's voice, the same tone that had once commanded sniper teams through high-risk extractions, made him obey immediately. As Daniel jogged toward the farmhouse, Sheriff Rodriguez's patrol car appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust. Her timing wasn't coincidental. Tom had spotted her vehicle patrolling the back roads earlier, keeping tabs on Mitchell's convoy. "Well, well," Mitchell drawled, watching the approaching patrol car. "Looks like we've got ourselves a real party forming." His hand rested casually near his waistband, where Tom had already noted the bulge of a concealed weapon. "Just remember what we talked about, Mr. Reeves. Hate to see anything happen to this nice spread of yours, or to that boy who seems so fond of you." The threat, veiled but clear, hung in the air like gun smoke. Tom's hands, which had been trembling slightly as they worked on the pump, grew steady, the same stillness that had once allowed him to take impossible shots under heavy fire. "Let me be clear about something, Mr. Mitchell," Tom replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded respect in combat zones. "That boy is under my protection. This land is under my protection. And I've spent too many years in too many bad places to be impressed by schoolyard bullies playing soldier." Sheriff Rodriguez pulled up just then, her timing perfect. She stepped out of her vehicle with her hand resting purposefully on her sidearm. "Gentlemen," she called out, "having a neighborly chat?" "Just leaving, Sheriff," Mitchell responded, his fake smile back in place. "Mr. Reeves here doesn't seem interested in our services. His loss." He turned back to Tom. "Think about what we discussed. Hate to see anything unfortunate happen because someone made the wrong choice." As Mitchell's convoy pulled away, Kate Rodriguez approached Tom. "You okay?" she asked, though she knew he was. She'd seen the way his stance had shifted during the confrontation, the combat veteran emerging from behind the rancher's facade. "They're planning something big," Tom said quietly, watching the dust cloud from the departing vehicles. This wasn't just intimidation. They were assessing response times, checking sight lines, looking for security patterns. Kate nodded. "I've got calls out to some contacts in the Marines. Mitchell's crew has been linked to a string of sophisticated livestock thefts across 3 states, but nothing ever sticks. They're too careful, too well organized." "They're not just thieves," Tom replied, his tactical mind processing everything he'd observed. The way they move, the equipment they're using, the precision of their operations. They're running military-style missions, and they're building up to something bigger than cattle rustling. As if to emphasize his point, a small drone buzzed overhead, its camera definitely not for casual photography. Tom and Kate watched it disappear over the hills, both recognizing it as the same type used for battlefield reconnaissance. "Be careful, Tom," Kate warned. "These aren't your typical troublemakers. They're trained, they're equipped, and they're not afraid to hurt people who get in their way." Tom's expression didn't change, but his eyes held the same focused determination they'd had during countless combat missions. "I know exactly what they are, Kate, and they're about to learn that they're not the only ones who remember their training." The tension in Miller's Creek ratcheted up like a sniper's scope adjustment over the following days. Mitchell's crew had effectively turned the Rusty Spur Saloon into their forward operating base, their presence casting a shadow over the once peaceful town. Their black trucks patrolled the county roads with increasing frequency, and their drones became a constant presence in the Texas sky. Sheriff Rodriguez watched helplessly as more ranchers began paying Mitchell's protection fees. The Hendersons were the first to cave after finding 2 of their prize bulls mysteriously slaughtered. The Whitakers followed suit when their irrigation system was sabotaged, threatening their entire season's crops. Even old Jim Peterson, who'd initially refused, changed his mind after his grandson's truck was run off the road in what was ruled a tragic accident. Tom observed these developments with the patient focus of a man who'd spent countless hours in sniper hides, waiting for the perfect moment. He noticed how Mitchell's operations followed classic military protocols: systematic reconnaissance, strategic pressure points, calculated escalation of force. They were using their training to slowly strangle the community into submission. Mary Ellen's diner, once the heart of town social life, grew quieter as people became wary of public gatherings. The Wednesday chicken fried steak specials that had once drawn crowds now served only a handful of regulars. Tom maintained his routine, though he noted how conversations would stop when Mitchell's men entered, their boots echoing on the linoleum floor like warning shots. Sarah Chen reported that business at the general store had dropped significantly. "People are scared, Tom," she confided one morning, her voice low. "Mitchell's men keep suggesting that we order our supplies through their approved vendors. Mike wanted to refuse, but—" She glanced at their daughter doing homework in the corner, and Tom understood the unspoken threat. The changing atmosphere affected young Daniel Martinez most visibly. The boy's parents had forbidden him from visiting Whispering Pines Ranch after Mitchell's men had made pointed comments about accidents happening to kids who don't watch where they're riding. Tom still saw him at Mary Ellen's occasionally, the boy's eyes carrying a mix of worry and determination that seemed too old for his young face. Kate Rodriguez worked tirelessly to build a case against Mitchell's organization, but their operations were too sophisticated to leave easy evidence. Their legal paperwork was impeccable, their public behavior just shy of actionable offenses. When questioned, witnesses suddenly developed foggy memories or produced receipts for legitimate security services. "They're using classic insurgency tactics," Tom explained to Kate during one of their private strategy sessions at his ranch. "Control the population through a mixture of fear and legitimate business. Make people question who they can trust. Break down community resistance gradually until submission becomes easier than fighting back." The sheriff nodded, recognizing the pattern from her military police training. "And anyone who tries to organize resistance becomes an example to others. The Johansson's barn burning down right after they tried to start a ranchers' association wasn't a coincidence." Tom's hands, steady now as they cleaned his hunting rifle, moved with practiced precision. "They're building to something bigger. These protection rackets, the cattle rustling, it's all groundwork for something else. Mitchell's investing too many resources, using too much military-grade equipment for this to be just about local extortion." Kate had reached the same conclusion. Her contacts in federal law enforcement had flagged similar patterns in other states, ex-military crews using sophisticated tactics to establish control over rural areas, always near major transportation routes. But by the time authorities connected the dots, the organizations were too entrenched to easily dislodge. The situation came to a head one evening at the Rusty Spur when one of Mitchell's men got rough with Mary Ellen's teenage son, who worked as a busboy. Tom had been nursing a coffee at the counter when he heard the commotion in the back. The scene he found was all too familiar. A trained operator using calculated force to demonstrate power, making an example of someone weaker. Without thinking, Tom's hands moved with the same precision that had once guided bullets to targets a mile away. In one fluid motion, he disarmed the man and had him face down on the floor, arm locked in a hold that brought tears to the thug's eyes. The movement had been pure muscle memory, a combat technique that was supposed to be long buried under years of peaceful ranching. Mitchell's other men reached for weapons but froze when Sheriff Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, her deputy covering the room's other entrance. The standoff lasted only moments before Tom released his hold, stepping back with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Just preventing an accident," he said mildly, but everyone in the room had seen something shift. For a brief moment, the gentle rancher's facade had cracked, revealing the warrior beneath. Mitchell, watching from his corner booth, studied Tom with new interest, reassessing the old man who moved with such deadly efficiency. The Hendersons were the first to cave after finding two of their prize bulls mysteriously slaughtered. The Whitakers followed suit when their irrigation system was sabotaged, threatening their entire season's crops. Even old Jim Peterson, who'd initially refused, changed his mind after his grandson's truck was run off the road in what was ruled a tragic accident. Tom observed these developments with the patient focus of a man who'd spent countless hours in sniper hides, waiting for the perfect moment. He noticed how Mitchell's operations followed classic military protocols: systematic reconnaissance, strategic pressure points, calculated escalation of force. They were using their training to slowly strangle the community into submission. Mary Ellen's diner, once the heart of town social life, grew quieter as people became wary of public gatherings. The Wednesday chicken fried steak specials that had once drawn crowds now served only a handful of regulars. Tom maintained his routine, though he noted how conversations would stop when Mitchell's men entered, their boots echoing on the linoleum floor like warning shots. Sarah Chen reported that business at the general store had dropped significantly. "People are scared, Tom," she confided one morning, her voice low. "Mitchell's men keep suggesting that we order our supplies through their approved vendors. Mike wanted to refuse, but—" She glanced at their daughter doing homework in the corner, and Tom understood the unspoken threat. The changing atmosphere affected young Daniel Martinez most visibly. The boy's parents had forbidden him from visiting Whispering Pines Ranch after Mitchell's men had made pointed comments about accidents happening to kids who don't watch where they're riding. Tom still saw him at Mary Ellen's occasionally, the boy's eyes carrying a mix of worry and determination that seemed too old for his young face. Kate Rodriguez worked tirelessly to build a case against Mitchell's organization, but their operations were too sophisticated to leave easy evidence. Their legal paperwork was impeccable, their public behavior just shy of actionable offenses. When questioned, witnesses suddenly developed foggy memories or produced receipts for legitimate security services. "They're using classic insurgency tactics," Tom explained to Kate during one of their private strategy sessions at his ranch. "Control the population through a mixture of fear and legitimate business. Make people question who they can trust. Break down community resistance gradually until submission becomes easier than fighting back." The sheriff nodded, recognizing the pattern from her military police training. "And anyone who tries to organize resistance becomes an example to others. The Johansson's barn burning down right after they tried to start a ranchers' association wasn't a coincidence." Tom's hands, steady now as they cleaned his hunting rifle, moved with practiced precision. "They're building to something bigger. These protection rackets, the cattle rustling, it's all groundwork for something else. Mitchell's investing too many resources, using too much military-grade equipment for this to be just about local extortion." Kate had reached the same conclusion. Her contacts in federal law enforcement had flagged similar patterns in other states, ex-military crews using sophisticated tactics to establish control over rural areas, always near major transportation routes. But by the time authorities connected the dots, the organizations were too entrenched to easily dislodge. The situation came to a head one evening at the Rusty Spur when one of Mitchell's men got rough with Mary Ellen's teenage son, who worked as a busboy. Tom had been nursing a coffee at the counter when he heard the commotion in the back. The scene he found was all too familiar. A trained operator using calculated force to demonstrate power, making an example of someone weaker. Without thinking, Tom's hands moved with the same precision that had once guided bullets to targets a mile away. In one fluid motion, he disarmed the man and had him face down on the floor, arm locked in a hold that brought tears to the thug's eyes. The movement had been pure muscle memory, a combat technique that was supposed to be long buried under years of peaceful ranching. Mitchell's other men reached for weapons but froze when Sheriff Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, her deputy covering the room's other entrance. The standoff lasted only moments before Tom released his hold, stepping back with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Just preventing an accident," he said mildly, but everyone in the room had seen something shift. For a brief moment, the gentle rancher's facade had cracked, revealing the warrior beneath. Mitchell, watching from his corner booth, studied Tom with new interest, reassessing the old man who moved with such deadly efficiency. The younger man stumbled away, rubbing his arm, his face flushed with humiliation and fear. "I'm going to finish my coffee now," Tom said, his voice returning to its usual gentle rumble. "Then I'm going to pay my bill and leave. Anyone who tries to prevent that will learn exactly how much of those mountain stories were true." Mitchell stood slowly, adjusting his jacket. "You've made your position clear, Ghost. Real clear. But remember, you can't watch everyone all the time. Can't be everywhere at once. His smile returned, cold as a sniper's calculation. And some of us learned a few mountain lessons of our own. As Mitchell's crew filed out, Mary Ellen hurried over to Tom's table. "Tom, I knew you were military, but—" "It's all right, Mary Ellen," Tom assured her, his hands showing their usual slight tremor as he lifted his coffee cup. "Some men only understand one language. Sometimes you have to speak it to keep the peace." But Tom knew as he watched Mitchell's trucks pull away through the diner's window that peace was the last thing on anyone's mind now. The coming storm would require every skill he'd learned in those distant mountains, every lesson paid for in blood and sacrifice. The warrior he'd tried to leave behind was awake now, and Miller's Creek was about to become a battlefield. The revelation that changed everything arrived in a plain manila envelope on Sheriff Rodriguez's desk early Monday morning. Inside were surveillance photos, service records, and a series of encrypted communications that painted a disturbing picture of Mitchell's true operation. Her military contacts had finally pieced together what the sophisticated cattle rustling operation was really covering: a massive drug trafficking network using ranches as distribution points, with local intimidation providing perfect cover for their real activities. Kate immediately drove out to Whispering Pines Ranch, finding Tom already awake and scanning his property lines with the practiced eye of a man who'd never truly left combat behind. As she spread the intelligence files across his kitchen table, his expression remained unchanged, but his eyes took on the focused intensity she remembered from mission briefings years ago. "They're using the cattle operations as cover," she explained, pointing to satellite imagery showing suspicious nighttime activities at compromised ranches. "The protection racket, the rustling, it's all elaborate misdirection. They're setting up a drug corridor right through Silverleaf County." "Makes sense," Tom replied, his tactical mind already processing the implications. "Remote location, compromised local infrastructure, military-grade security, perfect setup for major trafficking operations." His fingers traced the road on the map with the same precision he'd once used to plot sniper positions. "And anyone who gets suspicious just looks like another troublemaker in a cattle rustling dispute." Mitchell's previous operations followed the same pattern in 2 other states, Kate continued. By the time federal authorities caught on, the organization was too entrenched to root out without massive collateral damage to the local communities. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their discussion. Through his kitchen window, Tom watched 3 of Mitchell's black trucks roll past his property, their drivers making a show of casual observation that didn't fool his trained eye. A drone buzzed overhead, no longer bothering to be subtle about its surveillance. "They know you've got something," Tom said quietly. "Mitchell's men have been watching your office. That's why they're stepping up their presence. They're preparing to move their operation into full gear before you can act on whatever intelligence you've received." Kate's hand unconsciously moved to her service weapon. "I've got calls into the DEA and FBI, but they're at least 48 hours out. Mitchell's crew won't wait that long. Once they realize we're onto their real operation, they'll either try to silence any potential witnesses or bug out with whatever evidence they can destroy." Tom's hands, steady now, began methodically cleaning his old hunting rifle, a habit that had once kept him alive through long missions in hostile territory. "They'll move tonight," he said with the certainty of a man who'd studied enemy patterns for a living. "Full moon, clear weather forecast, and they've been stockpiling supplies at the Rusty Spur all week. Classic signs of an operation going hot." As if confirming his assessment, Tom's radio scanner crackled with encrypted chatter. Mitchell's men switching to secure communications, another sign of imminent action. Young Daniel Martinez had helped Tom set up a network of motion sensors around his property the previous week, disguising them as routine ranch maintenance. Now those sensors were showing increased activity on the back roads approaching Miller's Creek. "They're positioning vehicles at major intersections," Tom noted, watching the pattern emerge. "Setting up a containment perimeter, standard military protocol for controlling a target zone." His voice carried the same analytical calm he'd used when calling in fire missions in Afghanistan. "They'll try to lock down the town before making their move." Sheriff Rodriguez studied the man before her, not the quiet rancher the town knew, but the legendary scout sniper she'd heard whispered about in forward operating bases years ago. "What's the play here, Ghost?" she asked, deliberately using his old call sign. Tom's response was interrupted by the distant sound of helicopter rotors, too distant for normal ears but clear to those trained to recognize aerial insertion vehicles. "That's their extraction transport," he said, moving to a locked cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. "They're not planning to bug out. They're bringing in reinforcements." From the cabinet, he withdrew a weapon that hadn't seen daylight since he'd left the service. A custom-built, long-range precision rifle that had been his constant companion through countless missions. His hands moved over it with familiar precision, muscle memory taking over as he checked each component. "Kate," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command, "you need to get back to town. Rally whatever deputies you can trust absolutely. Keep them mobile, avoid fixed positions. Mitchell's men will try to neutralize law enforcement first. Standard protocol for this kind of operation." "And you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Tom's eyes had taken on the focused clarity she'd seen in combat veterans preparing for battle. "I'm going to do what I do best, find high ground, control the battlefield, and remind some people why they used to call me Ghost." He paused, checking his ammunition with practiced efficiency. Sometimes the only way to prevent a war is to show your enemy exactly what they're facing. The sun was starting to set over Miller's Creek, casting long shadows across the Texas landscape. In the distance, Mitchell's helicopters grew louder, and the encrypted radio chatter increased. The peaceful ranching community was about to become a battlefield, and its best hope lay in the steady hands of a man who'd spent years trying to forget the very skills they now desperately needed. The evening preparations at Whispering Pines Ranch carried the methodical precision of a military operation. Tom moved through his house with practiced efficiency, gathering gear he'd hoped never to use again. His hands maintained their combat-steady calm as he assembled his kit. Lightweight body armor hidden beneath a ranch jacket, night vision equipment disguised in everyday carrying cases, and communication gear that would let him monitor Mitchell's frequencies. The setting sun painted the Texas sky in shades of blood and gold as Tom positioned his equipment at pre-selected points across his property. Each location had been chosen months ago, his warrior's instincts never fully surrendering to civilian life. The old windmill, its weathered frame disguising a perfect sniper's hide. The hay barn's upper level, offering commanding views of all approach routes. The water tower, whose maintenance ladder provided rapid access to multiple firing positions. Mary Ellen arrived just before dusk, her truck's headlights off as instructed. She carried a bundle of local maps and building plans, documents she'd quietly collected over years of serving coffee to county officials. "The town's gone quiet," she reported, spreading the maps across Tom's kitchen table. "Mitchell's men have set up checkpoints on every major road. They're calling it a security exercise." Tom studied the maps with the same intensity he'd once applied to battlefield intelligence. "They'll use these buildings as strong points," he said, marking positions with practiced precision. "The grain silo gives them height advantage over Main Street. The old bank vault makes a perfect fallback position. They're thinking like military operators because that's what they are." Sarah Chen arrived next, bringing news from town. "They've got men watching the sheriff's office," she reported. "Kate's deputies are being followed everywhere they go. Mitchell's people are checking everyone's phones, saying it's four-signal interference with their security systems." Tom's radio scanner crackled with increased encrypted traffic, Mitchell's men switching to secure combat frequencies. Through his sniper's scope, he could see more vehicles moving into position around Miller's Creek, their patterns following standard military containment protocols. "They're not just locking down the town," Tom explained, recognizing the tactical deployment. "They're setting up a battle space, multiple fallback positions, overlapping fields of fire, dedicated escape routes. This isn't a protection racket going wrong. This is a prepared military operation." Daniel Martinez's father, a former Army medic, joined them as night fell. He'd brought medical supplies and confirmed what Tom's instincts were already telling him. "Their helicopters are military surplus, stripped of identification. Saw them landing at the old Peterson airstrip. They're bringing in heavy equipment too, the kind you don't use for cattle rustling." Tom's hands moved over his rifle with practiced familiarity as he laid out his plan. They'll hit multiple targets simultaneously. Classic shock and awe tactics. Sheriff's office first, then any potential resistance. They want the town locked down before federal authorities can respond. He assigned positions with the same quiet authority that had once commanded sniper teams through impossible missions. Mary Ellen would coordinate communications from her diner's basement, using the old ham radio network to maintain contact if cell services went down. Sarah's husband would organize a medical response center in the church basement, away from likely combat zones. "What about the townspeople?" Daniel's father asked, his medical training focusing on civilian casualties. "Most folks will be safer staying inside," Tom replied, his tactical mind running through scenarios. "Mitchell's men are trained operators. They won't risk collateral damage that could bring additional federal heat. Their targets will be specific: law enforcement, potential resistance, anyone who could expose their real operation." As his impromptu resistance team departed to their assigned positions, Tom made his final preparations. He'd positioned water and ammunition caches at key points across his property, each one concealed with the same care he'd once used to hide supply drops in hostile territory. His rifle, cleaned and checked multiple times, waited like a faithful companion. Sheriff Rodriguez made one final visit, arriving through the back roads she'd learned from years of patrol. "Federal response teams are mobilizing," she reported, "but they're at least 6 hours out. Mitchell's men will move before then." "They have to," Tom agreed, watching distant vehicle movements through his scope. "Their whole operation depends on controlling the situation before outside help arrives. They're following a playbook I've seen before: swift takeover, establish dominance, eliminate resistance before reinforcements can arrive." Kate studied the quiet rancher who had suddenly transformed back into the legendary operative she'd heard about in whispered stories. "You're sure about this, Tom?" "Once this starts." "Sometimes the only way to prevent a war is to show your enemy exactly what they're facing," Tom replied, his voice carrying the same calm certainty that had once guided impossible shots through mountain winds. "Mitchell's men are good, but they've forgotten something important about ghosts. We see best in the dark." As Kate departed, Tom settled into his primary position, his movements carrying the fluid economy of countless combat operations. The night wind carried the scent of approaching rain, and in the distance more helicopter rotors thundered. Mitchell's operation was about to begin, but they were about to learn why some legends never fade. They just wait patiently in the shadows. Through his scope, Tom watched Mitchell's men making their final preparations, noting their positions, equipment, and patterns of movement. His hands remained steady on his rifle, his breathing controlled and even, as he prepared to remind them why he'd earned his call sign in mountains far away and long ago. The midnight air over Miller's Creek crackled with suppressed tension as Mitchell's operation moved into its final preparation phase. Tom watched through his night vision optics as their forces deployed with military precision, tactical teams taking up pre-planned positions, communication gear being tested, and heavy equipment rolling into place under the cover of darkness. From his elevated position in the modified windmill hide, Tom could see the full scope of their operation unfolding. 3 helicopters had established a patrol pattern over the county, their infrared cameras scanning for movement. Tactical teams had positioned themselves at key intersections, their gear and weapons no longer concealed beneath civilian disguises. This was a full military operation now, with Mitchell's men dropping all pretense of being simple security contractors. Sheriff Rodriguez's voice crackled over the secure radio frequency they'd established. "Ghost, we've got movement at the south checkpoint. They're starting to stop all vehicles, checking IDs. 4-man teams, military gear. They're not even trying to hide it anymore." "They don't need to," Tom replied, his voice carrying the calm focus of a veteran operator. "This is their endgame: full containment before dawn, then systematic clearance of any potential resistance." His hands remained steady on his rifle as he tracked their movements through his scope. Standard protocol for taking control of a rural area, they're treating Miller's Creek like a combat zone. Through his optics, Tom watched Mitchell himself coordinating operations from the converted back room of the Rusty Spur. The man moved with the confidence of someone who believed they held all the tactical advantages: superior numbers, better equipment, and complete surprise. What Mitchell didn't know was that he was being watched by a man who had spent years perfecting the art of turning others' tactical advantages against them. Mary Ellen's voice came through on the radio next. 3 more trucks just pulled up to the grain silo. They're unloading some kind of heavy equipment. Looks military grade. They're setting up a command and control center, Tom explained, recognizing the pattern. The silo gives them height advantage and natural cover, but they're thinking like conventional military operators, predictable, by-the-book positioning. The radio crackled again, this time with Sarah Chen's voice. Tom, they've got men watching all the major buildings. They just posted guards at the church and school. Armed men, professional stance. Tom's mind processed the information with the same precision he'd once used to calculate 1,000-yard shots. Mitchell's men were following standard urban control procedures, but they'd made a critical mistake. They were fighting the last war, using conventional tactics against an unconventional opponent. A sudden burst of movement caught Tom's attention. Through his scope, he watched as Mitchell's men began moving toward the sheriff's office in tactical formation. This was it. The operation was going hot. Kate, Tom's voice carried the quiet authority of command. They're coming for the sheriff's office first. 3 teams, standard breach formation. They'll hit the power station next to cut communications. Sheriff Rodriguez's response was calm, professional. Already moved my deputies out. Left them a nice empty building to breach. Power station's got a surprise waiting too. Tom allowed himself a small smile, remembering how they'd spent the past week preparing for exactly this scenario. Kate's deputies were already mobile, using the back roads and hidden paths that didn't show up on Mitchell's tactical maps. The power station's backup systems had been modified to kick in automatically, maintaining essential services even if the main grid went down. The night erupted with the sudden sound of breaching charges as Mitchell's men hit the sheriff's office only to find it empty. Their frustrated chatter filled the encrypted frequencies as they realized their first objective had slipped through their fingers. They'll adapt quickly, Tom advised over the radio. Mitchell's too experienced to let one setback throw him off. Watch for secondary teams moving to cutoff routes. As if confirming his assessment, the helicopters began shifting their patrol patterns, focusing on likely escape routes. More vehicles appeared on the back roads, their movements suggesting they were searching for Kate's scattered deputies. Through his scope, Tom watched Mitchell emerge from the rusty spur, his body language showing controlled anger as he barked orders to his team leaders. They were still following their playbook, but the first phase of their operation had already gone wrong. Ghost. Kate's voice carried a warning tone. They're starting to move toward civilian areas now, looking for our people house by house. Tom's response was immediate. They're losing their discipline, splitting their forces, expanding their search area, making mistakes. His hands adjusted his rifle's position slightly, preparing for what he knew would come next. Mitchell will try to regain control by making an example. Watch for them to target someone prominent in the community. The prediction proved accurate as 2 of Mitchell's vehicles suddenly turned toward Mary Ellen's diner. They were about to learn their second mistake of the night, underestimating the preparation and resolve of a community that had been quietly getting ready for exactly this moment. The night was about to become very educational for Mitchell's men, as they were about to face not just a legendary sniper, but an entire town that had been carefully prepared by one. The ghost they dismissed as a tired old legend was about to remind them why some reputations are earned the hard way. The main assault began at exactly 2:15 a.m. when Mitchell's men simultaneously hit multiple targets across Miller's Creek. Breaching charges lit up the night as they struck the empty sheriff's office, their tactical teams moving with practiced precision through the abandoned building. At the same time, their helicopters dropped teams onto pre-selected rooftops, establishing overlapping fields of fire across the town center. Mitchell stood in his command post at the grain silo, watching the operation unfold through military-grade thermal imaging. His face showed growing frustration as each target turned up empty, not just abandoned, but prepared for their assault. Emergency generators kicked in automatically when they cut power to the grid. Communication systems remained active despite their electronic warfare measures. Every primary target they hit seemed to have been evacuated just hours before. Something's wrong, Mitchell growled into his radio. "This resistance is too organized, too prepared." His eyes narrowed as he studied the tactical displays. "Find me the old man." Everything started changing when we pushed him. But Tom Reeves was no longer at his ranch. He'd become a ghost again, moving between prepared positions with the same fluid efficiency that had once made him a legend in distant mountains. His first shot, when it came, wasn't even heard, just the sudden, precise disappearance of Mitchell's communication relay on the water tower. The encrypted radio frequencies erupted with confused chatter as Mitchell's teams lost contact with their command center. Their backup systems kicked in, but those frequencies were already compromised, mapped and monitored by Tom's own equipment. "West team, check in," Mitchell's voice crackled with growing tension. "East team, report status." The responses came back fragmented, describing a situation rapidly spinning out of their control. Their carefully planned containment was being systematically dismantled by unseen hands. Vehicle engines died at critical intersections, disabled by hidden EMP devices Tom had planted days ago. Sniper positions they'd selected turned out to be covered by better positions already occupied by Kate's deputies, their locations chosen by a master of the art. "He's hunting us," Mendez realized, his voice carrying a new note of respect and fear over the radio. "Using our own tactics against us." Tom's second shot came from an entirely different position, taking out the spotlight on Mitchell's command helicopter with surgical precision. The message was clear. He could hit anything he could see, and he could see everything. "Ghost is playing with us." Wilson's voice shook slightly as he reported another disabled vehicle. "He could be taking kills, but he's just taking equipment, making us blind, making us deaf." Mitchell's response was immediate and predictable. "All teams converge on the diner. If the old man wants to play games, let's see how he handles civilian targets." But Mary Ellen's diner had been prepared too. As Mitchell's men approached, they found their advance blocked by overturned cattle trucks, positioned days ago under the guise of routine deliveries. Every approach angle was covered by interlocking fields of fire from concealed positions. "Push through," Mitchell ordered, his composure cracking. "They can't cover every angle." The first team that tried to breach the diner's defense discovered exactly how wrong that assumption was. Precision shots from multiple directions disabled their weapons and equipment without causing a single casualty. It was a demonstration of skill that sent a clear message. They weren't being spared out of weakness, but by choice. "Fall back!" Mendez shouted, recognizing the tactical disaster they were walking into. "He's funneling us exactly where he wants us." Mitchell's operation was unraveling. His men, trained for direct military confrontation, found themselves being systematically outmaneuvered by an opponent they couldn't see or engage. Their tactical advantage had become a liability. Their movements were too predictable, their responses too by the book. "This isn't some washed-up old-timer," Wilson's voice carried the realization too late. "We're up against a ghost who's been playing us from the start." Tom's voice, when it finally came over their compromised radio frequency, carried the same calm authority that had once guided sniper teams through impossible missions. "Mitchell, you've got two choices now. Surrender to Sheriff Rodriguez or try to run. But remember, running's what I hunt best." The night air crackled with tension as Mitchell faced the reality of his situation. His carefully planned operation had been turned against him by a man who'd spent years preparing for exactly this moment. The legend they'd dismissed as a tired old man had just systematically dismantled their entire tactical advantage without firing a single lethal shot. In the distance, federal helicopters appeared on the horizon, the cavalry finally arriving. But the battle for Miller's Creek had already been decided by a ghost who'd reminded everyone why some legends never fade. They just wait patiently in the shadows for the right moment to reveal themselves. The aftermath of Mitchell's failed operation unfolded like dawn breaking over Miller's Creek. Federal agents swarmed the town, collecting evidence from the Rusty Spurs backroom that exposed the full scope of Mitchell's drug trafficking network. They found detailed plans for using compromised ranches as distribution points, each one carefully chosen for its strategic location along remote transportation routes. Mitchell himself surrendered just before sunrise, his tactical expertise finally overwhelmed by a superior strategist. His men, their military discipline broken by a night of being hunted by an unseen force, gave up without resistance. As they were led away in handcuffs, many of them cast nervous glances at the surrounding buildings and hills, still unsure exactly how many positions the legendary ghost had prepared. Sheriff Kate Rodriguez supervised the operation's cleanup, coordinating with federal authorities while maintaining a knowing smile. The DEA agents were particularly interested in how a small-town sheriff and her deputies had managed to outmaneuver a sophisticated criminal organization with military training. Sometimes, Kate explained, watching Tom's familiar figure on his porch through her binoculars, the best weapon in your arsenal is the one your enemy doesn't believe exists anymore. Young Daniel Martinez sat on Tom's porch steps the next morning, his eyes wide with newfound understanding as he watched his mentor clean his hunting rifle with the same steady hands that had protected their town. "Mr. Reeves," he asked, "were you scared when they came for the town?" Tom's weathered face creased in a gentle smile. "Being brave isn't about not being scared, son. It's about doing what needs to be done anyway. Fear's just nature's way of keeping us sharp." He ran an oiled cloth along the rifle's barrel with practiced precision. The trick is learning to use that edge instead of letting it use you. Mary Ellen reopened her diner that afternoon, serving free coffee to the federal agents still processing the scene. The regular customers returned too, their conversations now filled with stories about the night the ghost of Miller's Creek had protected their town. Each telling grew taller than the last, but the truth itself was remarkable enough. Sarah Chen reported that business at the general store had never been better, with folks from neighboring counties driving in just to see where the legendary showdown had taken place. Her husband had started keeping a visitor's book, though most people seemed disappointed that there weren't more bullet holes or signs of battle to photograph. "That's the mark of a true professional," Tom explained to Daniel when the boy mentioned the visitor's disappointment. "The best victories are the ones that look like they were never in doubt." The local paper ran a front-page story about the operation, carefully avoiding mention of Tom's specific role at his request, but word spread anyway, as it tends to in small towns. The trembling hands that had drawn sympathy now commanded quiet respect, and the stories children told shifted from whispered rumors to proud legends. Sheriff Rodriguez stopped by Whispering Pines Ranch a week later, bringing news that Mitchell's network was being dismantled across 3 states. "The feds are pretty impressed," she said, settling into a rocking chair on Tom's porch. "They can't figure out how one man managed to plan and execute such a comprehensive defense." Tom's hands showed their familiar slight tremor as he poured coffee for both of them. "Wasn't just one man," he replied. "Whole town played its part. I just helped them see what they were capable of." Kate nodded, understanding the deeper truth. Every rancher who'd shared information about suspicious movements, every shop owner who'd reported unusual purchases, every citizen who'd trusted their instincts, they'd all contributed to protecting their community. As summer rolled into fall, life in Miller's Creek returned to its regular rhythms. Tom resumed his Wednesday lunches at Mary Ellen's diner, telling Daniel stories about desert plants and weather patterns. His hands still trembled when he handled his coffee cup, but everyone now understood that some tremors came not from weakness, but from the weight of responsibilities willingly borne. The legend of the ghost grew quieter but deeper, becoming part of the town's fabric rather than its gossip. Young boys still rode their bikes past Whispering Pines Ranch, hoping to catch a glimpse of the old rancher who'd outmaneuvered an army. Parents still told their children that true strength wasn't always about what you could do, but about knowing when to do it. And if anyone noticed that Tom's eyes still scanned horizons with military precision, or that his daily routines never quite became predictable, they understood these weren't the habits of a man who couldn't leave his past behind, but the vigilance of someone who'd chosen to use his skills to protect rather than harm. Some legends, after all, never fade. They just find new ways to serve, standing guard over the peace they've helped create, ready if ever needed again. And in Miller's Creek, Texas, where an old rancher's hand still trembled as he mended fences and shared candy with children, the town slept easier, knowing their own legend watched over them, a ghost who'd chosen to become their guardian.